Hello, I am Nils Inge Brudberg, and I will, over the next 50 minutes, present the Program Management Office, DSOP, which I'm heading on behalf of the finance industry in Norway. The name of this program, DSOP, is Norwegian and doesn't translate well, but it means digital collaboration between finance industry and public sector. The idea of such a cross-sector program originally came from the finance sector some years back. The Norwegian banks have a long tradition of cooperation, even though, of course, also compete for the same customers. Their track record in building infrastructure and how they are organized with Finance Norway as a representative for all Norwegian banks and insurance companies makes it a natural first partner for public sector. Without this setup, the different public sector authorities would have had to set up a project with each of the 130 banks in Norway. Before I switch to the agenda for this presentation on the next slide, let me draw your attention to the logos at the bottom of this title page. These logos represent the current members of the DSOP program, and hence the members are of the PMO. Let me briefly go through each one, from left to right. Tax authorities brings in most of the money, for example, income tax that is spent by other authorities. Finance Norway is, as mentioned above, representing all the banks and insurance companies in Norway. BITS is Finance Norway's infrastructure company and is responsible for the common infrastructure used by the Norwegian banks. Because the first DSOP project involved the banks, DSOP found its natural home here. The Brønnøysund Registry Center and Altinn, many public registries are located here, and Altinn is key function in Norway's automated process for digital tax statements. We don't have to fill in a tax statement every year. All we have to do is go to Altinn and look at the statement the government has prepared for each one of us. Unless we change it, this becomes the tax statement for which the actual tax to be paid is calculated. The police does the same thing you expect the police to do in all countries and does not need further introduction now. In a few minutes I will describe how each of these authorities are involved in the different DSOP projects. The Norwegian Labour and Welfare Service, NAV. Some years back, Norway decided to merge the social security functions with the labor administration functions, and this became NAV. NAV is listed as the last member of the DSOP, but NAV spends most of the money the tax authorities brings in, so you could say last but not least. As you can see, the presentation is organized according to Global PMO Awards recommendation. I will first give you an overview of the DSOP PMO, including the members of the PMO and how these very different organizations have set up the DSOP program to have a minimum overhead and a maximum effect. I will then give you a brief introduction to how the DSOP program was initiated and why. You will also hear about major milestones we have put behind us. The next part will be the biggest one, and it focuses on governance and different PMO responsibilities per project. In order to give a good description of the governance structure in the program, I will both look upwards to the CEOs and downwards to the many DSOP projects, and sideways to the reference groups who give us guidance and new candidates for the future DSOP projects. The last 3 sections covered our objectives, our results, and our plans for the next month. Now, let's get started with a brief overview of the DSOP program and the PMO. The DSOP Program Management Office consists of 8 people, of which 6 represents the public sector and 2 represents the finance sector. On the left-hand side of the slide, you see 6 people from the public sector representing Norwegian tax authorities, Brønnøysund, the Norwegian Labour and Welfare Service, NAV, and the Norwegian Police. On the right-hand side, you see 2 of us representing Finance Norway and BITS, and as previously explained, we represent all banks and insurance companies in Norway. This group of people consists of business development resources and enterprise architectures from very different organizations. This DSOP PMO is therefore living open innovation every day, and some very good results have come out of this program already. I will talk more about this in the results sections towards the end of the presentation. When setting up this cross-sector program, it was a key success factor to recognize the fact that each member has its own process for innovation, allocating resources to projects going from test to production, and so on and so forth. With this setup, a DSOP project may consist of up to 7 organizations, each with their own internal project they have to respect and follow. We designed a logo that expresses how we address this challenge. The large circle in the middle represents common parts of the project. The small circle on the outside of the big circle represents the individual processes and tasks that are performed by each organization. They all have their own internal projects, which DSOP has no control over, and at the same time they take part in the central project. One example of this setup is the DSOP project, the loan process automation, where one bank makes the solution available to the customer's representative facing the customer, whilst other bank makes the solution available directly to the customers as a self-service solution. Common for the 2 banks is the way they get the customer's consent and how they pull data from tax authorities using the consent token. To keep administrative overhead to a minimum, it was decided to avoid a central DSOP budget. All the DSOP members covered their own expenses, and to keep the risk to a bare minimum, we tried to make them as small as possible in scope, often called minimum viable product philosophy. And we include no more than 3 banks in each project. Okay, so now you know a little bit about the DSOP program and the current members, but how did it all start? DSOP was established January 2016, and with the 3 first projects launched in mid-2016. From the start, it was the bank side of Finance Norway, tax authorities, and the National Registry, Brønnøysund, which participated from the start. Police and NAV joined in with new projects during autumn of 2017. Together with the insurance side of Finance Norway, As number of participants have grown, the way of working have been adjusted. When DSOP was established, the CEOs of Finance Norway, the Brønnøysund Registry, and the tax authorities decided that it was time to take digital transformation to the next level. Until January 2016, the focus was on digital efficiency within each sector, and now the CEOs wanted to achieve new and bigger benefits through sharing data across the silos. A key success factor for DSOP has been the senior sponsorship. One expression of the executive sponsorship was the article printed in Norway's biggest newspaper in June last year. Norway's Ministry of Finance, Siv Jensen, was introduced to the DSOP program by the three CEOs, and she was especially impressed by the live demo of the loan application process. The sharing of account information goes both ways. Not only do the banks send account information to the public sector when, for example, the police has a person or a company under investigation, but the tax authorities also sends to the banks data that is relevant for the credit check they perform for each loan application. Sometimes the banks are data consumers, and sometimes the banks are data providers. In Norway, we do have strict rules for sharing sensitive personal data like account information. The key to enabling this sharing of data is therefore either the user consent or the request is authorized by the law. In the beginning, I talked about the many participating organizations in DSOP and how the cost and benefits are distributed among these organizations. On top of these principles, the DSOP program also needs a governance structure. If there is a conflict in one of the projects, how does the steering committee escalate these issues to have it settled by the next level? This is the topic for the next section. This slide illustrates the DSOP governance structure. Let's start with the governance pyramid in the middle of the slide. At the top of the pyramid, you find the CEO Forum, and currently this forum includes executives from 5 participating organizations. They meet twice a year, and all major decisions in DSOP are approved or declined by this forum. Exactly which decisions will be covered when I'm presenting the next slide. Next level down in the pyramid, you see the DSOP steering committee. This group consists of senior management from the same organizations, and they meet every month. They have extensive authorities to initiate, stop projects, and handle escalated issues from the projects via our DSOP PMO. In addition to handling escalated issues from the ongoing projects, PMO meets bi-weekly to manage ID process and rigging new projects. There will be more on PMO responsibilities later in the presentations. As illustrated on the left and right-hand side of this slide, PMO also takes input from the different sectors. Initially, DSOP started with the banks, and now the program has been expanded to include insurance companies. on the public sector side, DSOP started with Ministry of Trade, Industry and Fisheries, and the Ministry of Finance. As mentioned earlier, the public sector has also been expanded to include the Ministry of Justice and Public Security, the Ministry of Labour and Social Affairs. At the bottom of the pyramid, you see all the ongoing DSOP projects. In a few slides, I will explain the different roles the PMO takes depending on the different DSOP project phases. But first I will talk about the declaration of DSOP. This is the document that describes the different project phases of a typical DSOP project. The declaration of DSOP. When actually the DSOP project had been launched and the partnership was put to the first test, the partner decided to write down some common rules of engagement. The document is not very thick and only contains the following sections. Starting from the top of the slide, you find the definitions of each project phase and their associated deliverables. In the box on the left-hand side, you see a list of all decisions gates and who has the authority to approve transition through the different defined project phases. Finally, on the right-hand side, you see some basic rules for communicating to the press on behalf of the program. Now, let me take the different project phases listed at the top of this slide and describe PMO's responsibility associated with each one of them. First project phase out is the ideation phase, and the first examples are taken from the current ID, the process following the death of a person. Many organizations want to improve this process, and the PMO has invited different stakeholders to a series of workshops to map out the current as-is process and to get an idea of an ideal future to-be process. We also asked for input on what to define as a first minimum viable product. Another responsibility for PMO is to create an initial estimate of potential savings, and for this project, the estimate says more than $1 billion over 10 years. And more importantly, this new digital process makes life much easier for the mourning family members. Another idea that passed the ideation phase recently was disability pension. This process was initiated by the insurance companies, and the Norwegian Labour and Welfare Administration agreed to help the financial sector with the data related to sick leave and disability pension. The ideation process included the same type of activities as described in the previous example, but it's worth mentioning that PMO in this example also prepared recommendation to proceed to the next phase, to the DSOP steering committee. After the steering committee had approved this transition to the concept phase, PMO was also responsible for getting the project started. Project leader, steering committee, and kickoff. Once the disability pension project was underway in the concept phase, PMO took on the role as the steering committee for the project. The project leader met regularly with the PMO to give a status and ask for assistance when there were issues in the project. And the completion of this phase The PMO assisted the project leader in creating the project report, and PMO recommended to the DSOP steering committee to go to the planning phase. As for the previous transition, PMO was also responsible for managing the transition to the planning phase. To illustrate the types of PMO activities associated with the next two phases, we have picked the control information project. The job to be done in this project is to send timely and accurate account information from the bank to the public sector to assist in control activities. For example, the police investigate a company for fraud. One important activity performed by the PMO in this project was to define common architecture for transmitting account information between public sector and the bank. PMO observed that different DSOP projects landed on different solutions for communication account information, and the banks refused to implement different processes for sending the same type of information depending on the receiving part in public sector. PMO therefore facilitated a process in which the entire public sector discussed this challenge and agreed to one common architecture for all DSOP projects. With this common set of principles for communication in the DSOP program, the project could finally proceed and start developing the actual code. DSOP was the first program to need this standardization, but this work will now proceed with the goal of making it standard for Norway. The last DSOP phase is the rollout phase, and in this phase, PMO facilitates a discussion on how the many DSOP projects in the pipeline should be released to deployment and management of these solutions once they are airborne. PMO has created a template for onboarding of new data consumers and suppliers based on the experience from the first project to be rolled out, consent-based loan application. Finance Norway has accepted to establish a support organization for this specific DSOP project. Both public sector and the banks can call this support organization for support. PMO is currently facilitating discussions on how the upcoming rollout should be managed by Finance Norway as the first project or a different model. Okay, so now you know some of the typical activities we do in our DSOP PMO, but why do we do these activities? What are the high-level objectives? PMO mission is to realize benefits in the finance sector, public sector, and for general public in Norway through the sharing of data. The mission can be broken down into three main objectives: ensure continuous flow of new good ideas and the transition from idea to actual project. When appropriate, facilitate standardization across the different DSOP projects. And 3, secure support for DSOP activities through proper stakeholder management, politicians, board of directors in the banks, and so on. These 3 main objectives are achieved by performing the following main functions. PMO meets every 2 weeks, and regularly these meetings are expanded into longer workshops to discuss specific ideas in the ideation phase. PMO also prioritize the project candidates based on input from external reference groups and recommends to the steering committee for DSOP which new project phases to approve. PMO is, as mentioned previously, responsible for the ideation phase and for all transition to new project phases. PMO also takes on the role as steering committee for projects in the concept phase. To ensure required support from the stakeholders and the general public, PMO is also responsible for running an annual full-day DSOP conference. PMO also sends out newsletters regularly and have other activities that involves communicating what DSOP is all about and the benefit associated with it. Given the objective I just talked about, what has the DSOP PMO achieved in the more than 2 years it has existed? In order to answer these questions, I will first talk about 2 high-profile projects, followed by some comments about the innovation funnel. I cannot really explain what DSOP PMO has achieved without bringing to your attention the fact that one of the intangible but very important results of this PMO work is the setup and the culture of collaboration introduced by the DSOP program. This open innovation approach to working together across silos gives us reasons to be really optimistic about the other collaboration projects that will follow from the DSOP in future. The loan process automation. One tangible result from DSOP PMO is the loan process automation, which is currently running in production in many banks. The biggest bank in Norway, DNB, is publicly claiming to be the first bank in the world to process a mortgage completely without human intervention. The new automated solution enables customers to get a response to the loan application within 2 minutes, 24 hours, 7 days a week. Let's take the process step by step, starting from the left-hand side. The customers first give their consent to the bank, allowing them to pull the credit scoring data from the tax authorities on their behalf. This operation is done using the user consent functionality made available by Altinn in the Brønnøysund Registry Center. The next step is performed by the bank, which collects the relevant tax and updated salary data for the customers from the tax authorities. Automating this process gives the bank huge savings, and at the same time customers get much better service from the banks. The customers can now let more banks compete for their business by applying for loans in many banks in parallel. This project was initiated by DSOP because the tax authorities wanted something in return for their effort in delivering huge benefits to the banks in the project. Loan process automation. The job to be done in this project is to send timely and accurate account information from the banks to the public sector, to assist in control activities, for example, the police investigating a company for fraud. The current process involves a lot of manual work on both sides, and as illustrated on the left-hand side of the slide. The requester has no standard way to ask for the information, and the banks who get these requests have no standard way to respond. In one example from the police department, it took 3 weeks to get account information they had asked for, and they received the response on many different formats: PDF, Excel, Word, etc. With the automated digitalized process shown on the right hand side, there will be major efficiency gains and the data quality will also improve. To summarize, this project will deliver a benefit to the authorities by enabling at least 10 times as many checks of account information from banks per year. By preventing fraud and catching the crooks, this project also secures the Norwegian welfare system a benefit for all the citizens of Norway. One of the hidden gems of this control information project is the car register. This register was originally established by the banks and for the banks to ensure that all accounts used in a payment transaction were valid and active. It contains all the accounts for all the banks in Norway, and they are required to continually update the register. With DSOP, this register is being opened up for use by public sector as well as, and this enables some of the great benefits. Rather than ask all banks to send information about a given organizational number, if they know the company, the authorities can now ask CAR for a list of banks who know this customer, and then only ask these banks for a list of accounts for this customer and possibly the balance on these accounts. This is the flow illustrated in this slide, and it shows that the other 130 banks do not have to receive and process this request from the authorities. The mere fact that the police or the tax authorities ask for information about the company is in itself sensitive information. It is therefore of great value to keep the list of banks they have to ask to a minimum, as described above. The innovation funnel. In addition to the delivered and ongoing projects, PMO has also been responsible for a healthy innovation funnel. In this slide, I want to briefly explain that what PMO is looking for when evaluating new ideas. A key point is to keep the project small, and by sticking to this rule, reduce the consequence of failure and being able to demonstrate value quickly. The idea of improving the process following a person's death is one example of an idea that looked very promising in the innovation funnel. Another interesting idea is to enable auditors to tap into the same flow of account information that the banks are building for the public sector. They also need this information, and their clients currently give them their consent to get the account information from the banks. But today this is a very manual process. Reusing already developed code for new purposes is a key benefit of the DSOP program, and at this point in time we have enough functionality available to really see the potential of such reuse of functionality. As mentioned in the slide, there are many other promising ideas in the innovation funnel that the PMO is working on. Now that I have covered governance, objectives, and some of the results from this program and achievements that can be attributed to this DSO PMO, what is next for our PMO? Focus area number 1 for DSOP PMO in the next 12-month period is to realize the expected benefits by successfully delivering the ongoing projects and enabling the recently established DSOP Operations Center to take over responsibility for new projects as they come out successfully pilot. It is also an important objective to launch good new projects, and especially the ones that can utilize already developed functionality in new areas. The process following the death of a family member is an example of a new project with many different stakeholders and huge potential benefit. As a last objective worth mentioning, PMO will work for increased maturity of the DSOP program and its associated PMO. We need more effective collaboration tools, and there is a plan for increased emphasis on the lessons learned, input from the many DSOP projects to identify opportunities for improvement. Since this is not a real-time video conference, I encourage you to contact me for any questions or comments you may have. My contact details are included on this last slide. Thank you for listening to this recorded presentation.